Okay, pod 3, so I can get us started for tonight. I am going to start us with the TEDx video titled The Best Kindergarten You've Ever Seen by Takahura Tezuka, and I apologize if I am mispronouncing his name. So not sure if everyone got a chance to see the video, but the video was speaking to the structure and system design to set a school or classroom up to best meet the needs of its students. And as you can tell by the title, the grade band or developmental level that this particular school that he's speaking about was modeled after a kindergarten classroom. So the big idea for the text was that in order for students to be able to survive and thrive in the environments in which they live, they need to be prepared for it. So to prepare young children for what lies ahead, the presenter outlined a few key talking points. The first talking point that was articulated was just which I thought was an interesting place to begin. And it was literally just the place, the structure, the environment. And he spoke about limiting boundaries, both in the physical sense, but also in the behavioral sense. So the building was designed without any walls. It was designed to align and bring together both indoors, outdoors, outdoors, indoors. He does a much better way of explaining it than that. But like within a climbing structure or a working space, there will be a tree, an actual tree, or like in an outdoor space, there will be opportunities for, again, more like meeting areas and structures. So a very fluid learning space that connects the indoors and outdoors. He also has this really interesting philosophy about roofing and boxing in individuals. So the one structural element that he, not considering walls, but that he really spoke at length about was the roof, and the roof was extremely low so that, again, it didn't feel like it was a boundary. It seemed part of its space. So even students, the roof was so low that students that were above, like on, say, a platform, could still engage and pass things, and we're still learning and discussing and engaging with students on the lower level, if that makes sense. It was really an interesting architectural philosophy on how to set up a classroom design. In addition to the classroom, he then moved into just the overall philosophy and culture of the space. So he talked about, again, like I said, limiting boundaries, but also, typical classrooms are meant to be quiet, structured, but he said, no, noise is important. Students or just people are meant to be around, and the idea that you can't attend in a noisy situation. He brought up a funny thing, like how many of you have been at a concert, or how many of you have been at a bar or at a restaurant and can still attend to what's happening, and you can still engage with those around you. And those are the environments that work environments are not always so structured and quiet, and that they should have the ability to learn how to attend and engage in environments that have noise. He mentioned strategically allowing for quote unquote small doses of danger, and that putting students in riskier or having to navigate problem solving or set their own boundaries for the risks that they want to take. For example, if they're, on a climbing structure, or they're working with something, and just cautioned the, adults to not protect them too much and not to control them too much. He was talking about the principle of, or what their equivalent to the principle would be in Japan, I believe this was. And he said, a teacher asked, but what if the student wants to run out? What if the student wants wants to leave like where we're working or we're engaging. And the principal says, you let him go. He'll go. And then when he's ready, he'll come back. And they were showing clips of just that happening. And for me, I'm thinking back to my classroom days, and I was like, and I ran a very fluid, open, you need to go for a walk, you go for a walk. Like that was how, but even that, I was like, oh my goodness. And at kindergarten, I was like, oh, they're so little. What if you got to keep your eye on them? But it was just so progressive of an idea. But anyway, I'm digressing. Let me get back to my notes. So I feel like this relates, so tying this back to curriculum and what we've been really studying throughout the progression, throughout the course, is that to me, this video and this philosophy and this idea of how to set up educational spaces really elevates the idea that curriculum is more than just words spoken from teacher to student. That when thinking about what students should be learning, the where and how needs to be a part of that conversation, and the entire structural system aligns, and that should be taken into consideration. I was thinking back to my positionality, and this video really brought me back to my own childhood and experiences in schooling during my early academic years. I was a struggling student. I struggled learning how to read. I did not have any preschool or classroom experience. I was a kid of the late 70s, early 80s. So my background, my neighborhood, I was free. So I did struggle with the structure and boundary and kind of fitting into the box. I put in my post, I don't know if you read it, like I was that student that if we were like walking to lunch and there was a staircase, in my head I was like, can I jump 4 stairs today? And I would like leap the stairs.
You're
and
that
then
kid.
I was that kid. And I would be so proud of, I remember, like I have a vivid memory, and I was so proud of myself. And I turned to my teacher to be like, aren't you proud of me? I just jumped 4 stairs finally. Like I haven't been able to do that. And she was disappointed in me. And I was like, but I just achieved something. And I remember grappling with that in kindergarten. But anyway, I'm digressing. But so to me, it made me think about how maybe some of my learning struggles, because I had a very difficult time learning to read, might have been exemplified because of the environment in which that I was learning it. And not just, I loved my elementary experience, and my teachers were there for me, and I felt like I got what I needed. However, just thinking of the overall how school is set up, it sometimes isn't always set up structurally for the needs of all learners, as we all know. So this just really brought to me, in my positionality, how different my learning development may have been if I was in a more unstructured learning environment as the one depicted in the video. So thinking about how it applies to today's discussion, again, the video depicts the importance of discussing all components of educational spaces, systems, and structures, even environments, like the physical space, when discussing curriculum and how we are educating our students. And that was just a positive reminder to me, and I feel what this video really articulated well.
Such an interesting idea about like considering the physical environment as part of the curriculum. I think that's such a really interesting idea that I don't think we pay enough attention to. I mean, obviously, like, many years ago, the physical environment was definitely more row oriented, and like classrooms had lecterns in them and that sort of thing. And now, most of the classrooms in my school are in collaborative groups, either partners or groups of 4 or 5s working together. But that's a really interesting concept to consider.
Yeah. I went so I teach substantially separate, and my first thought was like all the ways this could go bad. And I mean, like, we have a pretty dangerous public housing behind our school. We had a kid a couple months ago hop 2 fences and like run into some guy's apartment. And we had to send staff in to like pull this kid out.
Oh no.
To pull him out. And that could have gone, I mean, there's so many ways that could have gone wrong. So I'm like, but the flip side of that is this kid was a little bit older, and he goes to school in what essentially looks like a castle with fences all around it. And maybe if we started some of that earlier, that and made it safe, maybe teach self-regulation skills, maybe some of that stuff doesn't happen so severely. So I don't know.
But you think about like how litigious things are. I mean, like we wouldn't I don't know about in your school, but if you have a substantially separate, like a kid leaves the room, everybody's on a walkie-talkie looking for a safety care team, to make sure the kid doesn't elope into traffic or like leave the property. And, just the idea of like letting a kid walk out, that made me a little nervous when she was talking about that, because I think of like the litigious nature of our society. Like, when was the writing done or the video done? Did it talk about like the time period that this was about?
That is a great question. Let me go back to my notes. The video itself was made in 2014. So I would imagine, and the school looks like it has been well established. So I would probably say around within 10 years of that video. Right.
Go ahead.
No, that's okay. I've talked enough. You can go ahead.
No, I was just going to say what really stuck out to me from what you were saying about the video was the concept of students setting their own boundaries and deciding for themselves what kind of risk they wanted to take that day. So I think that's an interesting concept that could be translated to our work, our paperwork in class, our assessments, is students setting the bar for themselves and kind of learning how to evaluate themselves and setting goals for themselves. So I think that idea can be translated into, I mean, what you're saying is a little bit radical in the video. I know, like at my school, the rules are so rigid. If my students are in the bathroom for longer than 10 minutes, I'm supposed to write them up. Like I'm supposed to time each student. So getting them to go let them go where they want, that wouldn't happen. I love the idea of it, but in a more realistic sense, within the confines and the boundaries that teachers are subject to, I think something like applying that concept to assessment would be really cool.
Yeah, that's a great point. And he did speak at length to that. And one other point that he spoke to that I forgot to mention, and you just reminded me of, Amanda, because it ties in with that idea of like, a child figuring out their own boundaries and levels of risk, and even what they wanted to study, like what project they were working on, what, things they wanted to learn, read, things like that, was also self-directed. But they were also talking about increasing student agency, which is something that we talk a lot about throughout all of schooling. And they talked about, in a way to create student agency is for them to, one, feel like they can support the teacher. Like they're not just there to like be the sponge from the teacher, but they're also there to support the teacher. They help out and to help like their peers. So the level of authority and like the teacher-student relationship and the peer relationship seems very different in this structure, which I found.
I like it. I'm hearing a lot of the 6 C's of motivation in there: the choice, consequence, collaboration. Forgetting the rest of the 6, but I'm hearing a lot of those things in there.
Anyone have anything that ties into that well?
I mean, I guess maybe some of the need for, I'm trying to look through my notes to see how it ties maybe to that state-based curriculum making, but I guess since I spoke, I guess I can just, I can go next, especially, because Trish will probably follow up with part 2.
Mhm.
Since I'm assuming it's scaffolded, I don't necessarily want to, go to part 1 after she does part 2. But yeah, it was state-based curriculum making, and that was by Sivesind in Westbury. I'm not sure if it's the same Westbury that you covered, Francis. But just and I'll move through my notes more succinctly than I did last week. But the main theme was really just that it was this exploration of how like state-driven curriculum has just evolved like over the years, and how state-based curriculum is really just being used to inform a lot of like current practices in education. And so what it says is that state-based, at least at that level, is going from something that was just more occasionally done, as far as developmental change in curriculum, to something that has just been more of a continuous process that's not only shaping educational systems at the state level, but also to national. So it was trying to tie all of those in. One of the things that I recalled from, I don't know if any of you have taken the policy class, I took it last quarter with you, and talking about the policy making process, there was all this kind of just these intersecting interests, right? Like political interests, educational interests, and how people are going to be able to meet all these competing needs. And so there was like a quote that I just had underlined here where, the author says that curriculum policy is not only political in the sense of being a practical resolution to public debate, but it is political in the party sense, right? And so I was able to make that connection from some previous learning, because there was a lot of people talking about that, right? Whose needs are really being met? Is it really the student, the system, the district, or is it really more this political influence that's going to drive, we go, with curriculum? And so the article does a really good job of lifting up curriculum as being kind of this mediator, was the word that I wrote down, as far as like public debates, political issues, but also too what teachers are doing in the school. And so just again, the intersection of those interests shows how people tasked with curriculum development really have to do this nuanced job of trying to balance whose needs get met and how they get met. That application to curriculum discussions, I think and it talks about educators when they're tasked with making sure that implementing curriculum is inclusive and equitable. Wrote the article recognizes, and that's kind of what I just said, that curriculum is this tool for making sure that public, political, and professional interests can be used to make sure that what is developed is just more inclusive and responsive. I thought.
Sorry to interrupt you, Bryan. Can you say that one more time? Because that ties into my article. I want to make sure I have it written down so I can refer to it later.
Oh, just in recognizing the curriculum is just this way of managing public, political, and professional interests, that it can guide efforts to make sure that the curriculum is more inclusive and responsive, from a cultural standpoint. And just that, as policymakers and educators, people they have this opportunity to have curriculum be this reflection of people's just lived experiences and realities, right? They have the opportunity, but again, there's just all those competing demands, I think, that just make it not always what people intended to be. Based on my positionality, you guys work, in primary and secondary education, so your experience is a lot different, because you guys are working with, core curriculum. I work in higher education, so I've, co-wrote a couple of, elective classes and things, but these aren't like, core classes. So I think that the political aspect of it is something I haven't necessarily had to deal with. Am I mindful of making sure that, yes, they're different learning styles, lived experiences, what is going to be most relatable to my student experiences is at the forefront of helping to write classes in the way that I deliver them. But I don't have that layer of, political influence where somebody is going to say, okay, you know what, you can do this, but you can't do that because, there's administrators or other people involved in that process. So, when I hear you guys talk about it, it seems like, you go through different layers of, people having to deal with, different interests. And it's just something I'm unfamiliar with in higher education. But at least it was kind of like the starting point to how at the state level, curriculum is designed. And so whoever, and now that I know this Trish, had part two, I was interested in knowing how the authors took that a step further, and what whoever had that article got out of that reading. So.
Yeah, in mine, I think it was, it definitely feels like a continuation of the ideas that you just talked about. Like, I pulled out a few particular like comments that I thought were particularly interesting during the write-up or during that particular section. And it talked about the state curriculum becomes a framework for the ideological governance of schools and school systems. And so, they talked about how making curriculum is an attempt to define and control the social distribution of knowledge. So, and that every decision, no matter how big or how small, is about what to teach or what to leave out. And, they have to have systems to provide legitimacy to that process of developing the curriculum. So they talk a lot about, curriculum making commissions and how that's like a public process, and that in that process they find ways to like infuse things that are happening currently into existing, like you have core curriculum, but then there are certain things that happen in society, like they talked about like the AIDS crisis, or they talked about like different issues around gender equity that like have to get infused into a curriculum somehow. And so they talk about like having this public process that kind of always has to be relooking and revising curriculum. And they talked about like some of the conflicts in curriculum making. So they talked about like knowledge conflicts, conflicts of perspective, conflicts of choice, conflicts of recombination, and conflicts of position. And kind of overall, they talked about that the commission itself is a structure that brings representatives from like the public and teachers into the state's decision-making process. So like, for example, in my state in Massachusetts, every time they're going to revise curriculum, they ask for people to be part of that process. They ask for people who want to work on that. So often teachers will get the opportunity, or administrators will get the opportunity to join like larger committees, and they'll take their thinking and like sort of hone it down, and that will become part of the things that are presented to the commission. The commission will also like put out public comment times when they have curriculum revisions that they're making, and before things are voted on or finalized, members of the public can all join these like big conference calls or Zoom calls where they can like lend their voice to what is or what's not in a given curriculum before it goes to the Board of Education to get finalized. Or not the Board of Education, but the state.
Okay, yeah, so it does sound like it just played off of, or it just went deep into a lot of those things. But yeah, kind of that need for, all these different, people that, involved in the process. And then, how do you meet the needs of all those, all those people involved as well? So,
and they, talked about like that's a way of trying to add some legitimacy to that and some deliberation to that.
Yeah.
Like, where is everybody from? I know like we have Connecticut.
I'm in Connecticut, yeah. And Amanda, you're in Connecticut too, right?
Right.
Yes, I am.
Yeah.
And then Francis, you're in Massachusetts, right? And
Connecticut, then Mass. I got you guys all covered.
I was in Connecticut and Mass too. And Lori, you're in Mass. Yeah. So, I mean, in Connecticut, what's the process for curriculum? Do they have a similar commission that they do in Massachusetts?
It's really funny you should ask, because I'm in Dr. Yule's policy class right now.
I love that class.
Yeah, it's really interesting. And I just wrote my paper about the Common Core state standards and teachers' involvement in that, or lack of involvement in that. So the process here, it varies very much from district to district.
Yeah.
So in the district that I'm currently in, I'm the curriculum writer for English, but I know that in most other districts, they don't have the teachers write the curriculum. So I'm fortunate that we have that agency there. But even though I'm able to write it, it then has to go through my department chair, then through my principal, then through the Board of Ed. And then, the Board of Ed is responsible for going back and forth with the powers that be at the state level to make sure that we are adhering to those state standards. So we're kind of allowed to create what we want as long as it's within the confines of the district standards. Although there is red tape, there have been many times where I've proposed different texts and been shot down. So although we have the illusion of choice, it's not really there. They're still wanting to stick to the canon, even though they claim they want to introduce different voices, at least in my experience.
Yeah, see, and that's so much different than like the higher ed. It's like based on topics of interest, right? It's like students are really interested in this. You know, you lay out some, you know, really good goals and learning objectives, and it kind of goes with like, you know, like a particular major. It can be used as an elective or something like that. There's not that many, you know, different layers of people that are likely to reject it, as long as it's something that they think the students will be interested in and register for. So, so please.
Well, that's my dream.
Oh, wow.
I know. That's what I was just thinking too. I was like, oh, one day I'll be in higher ed.
That's a whole different, that's a whole different animal. But 5 years at it, a whole different animal. So I'm sure we all could probably talk about some things that we just may want to see tweaked a little bit.
Yeah. I was thinking it's interesting hearing about, you know, Connecticut's role, and I know here in Mass too. I would love to get the perspective of somebody who isn't in a local control state and how this connects to the article and what you're talking about, because this, you know, state-based curriculum making, are they talking about making curriculum that is, you know, for the quote unquote state, or if it's like, you know, whatever organization they're talking about, or is there still a level of control? Because while we have standards and frameworks, I mean, really it's up to the districts and to decide what is the best curriculum for their school. But it's interesting because I feel like there's a little bit of a shift where, even though, and I don't know if Connecticut's experiencing this as well, but here in Massachusetts, where we are a local control state, but now I'm hearing, being at the department, that other, you know, they're talking at other legislation, right? We're just the executive branch, but other legislators in education, the Board of Education, are talking about, you know, making, yes, you can choose your own, but here's a criteria, here's a list of, you know, materials or
They're calling it high quality curriculum.
Right, that are,
yeah,
high quality instructional materials. In fact, my office, like, we really are, like, I'm involved in a network that helps you implement high quality instructional materials. And that's not the development of it. That's not that process. But I'm wondering, in this, you know, in the article that you were reading, the state-based curriculum making, did it get to is this once this curriculum is developed, is it across the board for all?
in mine, it was more talking about these governing boards that, and it was this was taking place in another country. So this article was from over in Europe. So it had a different spin to it. So it wasn't it didn't talk about if everyone was getting the same, but they were talking more about the idea of having these curriculum boards, which made me think of DESE and, how they have so we don't, you're right, we don't have a specific curriculum that comes from the state, but we all have to adhere to the frameworks and the standards. But what Massachusetts has been doing is it's been sort of vetting certain curriculum materials, and it has been sort of nudging districts through grants. So they're basically saying, yeah, you can make up your own stuff if you want to, but here we will give you a grant for $200,000 to implement one of these things that are on our clearinghouse list. And so districts have been sort of saying, at least in our district, we've been talking about oh, well, is this sort of they're hey, start picking one of these now, because eventually we're going to require you to pick one of these. So get it now so we can at least get some people on board and get them moving, and but at some point we're going to say, no, your curriculum has to come from this list because these have all been vetted as high quality and they meet the standards and they meet the requirement of the framework. So
I know for the area I teach and probably the area Amanda teaches, that might as well be a mandate because we don't have money for other curriculum. I mean, we can't afford to go out and choose.
Right.
If that's what the grant is for, then that's what we're using. And,
Yeah.
you know, I can give you stories of 5 different curriculums over the last 5 years where they were like, this is the new thing. And then the funding runs out and they, oh, nope, actually, this is the new thing. And it's just a matter of, I'll go to my administrators, hey, we have all this data that we're collected and we want to, you know, be able to go through the grades with these kids and do that. And they're like, if you can come up with 20 grand, go for it. And if not, move into the new thing that only costs 8.
So they're using money to kind of push a more dictated curriculum.
Yeah, it's like the choice when I give my kids. You can either do
The
English or do
guided
math.
choice. The
They're
guided
like,
choices.
yeah. My article actually goes right into that. If you're cool with me going next, Amanda.
Yeah.
So it talks about this is the Westbury and like 7 other authors.
At all.
Yeah, the all right.
And it talks about what drives the changes to curriculum and pretty quickly goes right into that. Yes, it's all different everywhere. I mean, you can, you know, every school is going to be different at some level, but what changes it really is ultimately ends up being from the top down. And many of those things as it goes down, you know, it made me think of like Plinko, where it's just like it's nudged a little bit over and over and over again. And a lot of those things are political. So, you know, there are boards in Connecticut and Mass, but many of the people, you know, the governor is appointing most of the heads of those organizations and those committees. So then they appoint some more people, and then, you know, pretty soon those are pretty loaded up, and they do let teachers participate some in Connecticut and Mass, but you know, we're also at the top of the educational you know, progressive group of the states. You know, I think both are in the top 5 usually when it comes to those things. So, you know, I think I was trying to think more like across the US, like how does this impact all these schools? And the authors point out that one of the main functions of curriculum often becomes a way for an educational system in an area to legitimize their system and their ideas, which is a little bit of a scary thought in my mind because many of these are relatively short-term decisions. You know, these people who are elected are not looking at the student for 20 years because none of those offices are being held for 20 years. So by the time a kid gets out of higher ed, you know, that person is long gone who is making a lot of those decisions. So it kind of begs the question, are they thinking about these long-term goals and what we should be setting up for as we make these incremental changes? And what the impact of not thinking about that will be like. So, Bryan, you said it recognizes curriculum as a tool for public, political, and professional interests, right? But, you know, nowhere in there does it talk about the well-being of well-rounded individuals, right? And Trish, you were talking about how, you know, curriculum is deciding over and over again what's included and what's left out. So, you know, kind of the way they can push around the money too, they don't have to necessarily push ideas even. It's just you leave out a bunch of stuff. And even that can go sideways. Not to even mention the plenty of examples I'm sure we could all think of where it feels legitimately like malicious or detrimental to what actually happens in the schools. So he says that most of the input that's considered is community leaders, but those aren't the people who are examining the data. Often they certainly aren't, at least at the top level. It's not often teachers. It's not people who are, the boots on the ground. So it's important to scrutinize that. And it's important to scrutinize the assumption that the development of the curriculum is actually trying to provide a good education. So I think a lot of us go in looking at it like, oh, well, everyone must be working toward this goal of providing a good education. And this group of authors brings up like, maybe, that's not a safe assumption to make, and that's a little naive. But, if your goal is to just push these ideas, calling it curriculum lends some credibility. And I think a lot of people just say, oh, yeah, well, of course, that's what they're thinking about. And we should just all kind of accept it. So that was the main push of the article. It really made me think about, like, of course I have my idea of good, and I know it's not going to align with everyone's idea of what a good education is. And as we're talking about these things, like, we're really in the minority of what people think should be taught in schools. Like, just if you even took a big swath of people from Connecticut and Massachusetts, that's probably not where, that's a pretty progressive group of people if you're thinking nationwide. The last thing I'll leave off with is just to think about the capacity that curriculum can have to really change someone, make them feel alienated, make them feel or make them abandon ideas or adopt ideas. So even as you were saying, Bryan, you were like, I get to choose so much of the curriculum based on student interests. And I'm like, we've already been working on those kids for 12 years before you get to them, man.
Yeah.
Where do you think those ideas come from?
Yeah.
All interesting to think about. I've been excited to talk about this since last week when we were discussing, like, where does this stuff all come from,
What's interesting, so I, in full disclosure, my dad served, I think 2, maybe 3 terms as a board chair of a local district around here. And so, like, in reading some of these articles over the last couple of weeks, we have to catch up at some point over the weekend. But I want to pick his brain, like, from that seat, like, what is that like? Because I think it'll give me a lot of insight. I'm not using him for the voices of the people, even though I'm sure he probably would have some interesting responses. But just to be able to talk through him, talk to him about some of that stuff, because I've never been involved, obviously, at that level, but also too in primary and secondary education. So being in those rooms, having some of those discussions, I wonder what that's like. And since he's not there anymore, I figured he could probably share some of that stuff with me. So if I get anything that sounds really insightful, I'll be happy to share any of that back. Where his thoughts lie as far as trying to manage that board. So yeah, I'll be happy to share.
So Francis, did the article talk about or do you have thoughts on how to get more teacher voice into the mix?
It doesn't really. It seems, or my read of it was that it was more like an indictment about what's going on than
offering solutions.
Yeah. But or maybe indictment's a little strong, but certainly like a criticism. And I'm trying to scroll to the end and look at my notes here. It really doesn't. I think like what Bryan was saying is, and this is not from the article, this is just my own 2 cents, but like really just getting people more involved. I personally don't think we should probably destroy the DOE or stop doing that, but like
Lori thanks you.
Yeah.
Lori thanks you.
But when I look at like who the people are appointing these people and staffing these things, can you imagine going to a doctor's office and then being like, listen, we grabbed these 3 guys off the street. Like one of them is the head of a local church, one of them is a politician, and one of them was just like a guy who was willing to do this for $100. And we brought him in to decide what your treatment should be. Like, what an insane thing. But that's what it feels like what we're doing with education. We should be looking at evidence-based practices, and we should be talking to teachers and the people who are delivering those things.
I was thinking about that when all of you were discussing your articles, and especially the question about, what drives the changes to curriculum. And then when we were thinking about, and I remember reading the article on myself and talking about these committees, they call them like education ministries or these curriculum committees that are created just for the sake of this curriculum development. And then they're disbanded and they go about their merry way. So I was thinking about, not only who are the people that are being charged with this really formidable task, and are the people who are the experts in the field kind of, where are they in this kind of structure, and where's the accountability if if these committees, boards, and I know in our country it's a little different, but I'm just going back to the article that Bryan and Trish read and looking at how countries in Europe, such as Germany, which I know was mentioned in the article, talked about like pulling together these curriculum committees or educational ministries, creating this, being a part of this development, and then they're disbanded. So then I was thinking, how do they then get held not accountable, like there's a consequence, but
Right.
Where is that accountability piece to make sure that, I don't know, what you sought to do was actually came to fruition?
I mean, I have to say, like, I haven't worked on or volunteered for curriculum writing at the state level, but I have been on committees where they've been working on assessment tools. Like, I was a science teacher for many, many years, and so I was like on the science MCAS development, and I know people who have been on like the ELA MCAS development piece. And the thing that does give me hope is that the people who are on those committees are incredibly intelligent and thoughtful people. I think if there was one sort of downfall, what in my experience was that there were a lot of like really super intelligent young people who probably didn't have enough time in the classroom to kind of understand the impact of the classroom, but like their intentions and their education and their thoughtfulness in the process, at least from an assessment perspective, has always been really great quality. It's just, I think what they lack is sort of classroom experience to kind of see, okay, how does a teacher balance this with all the other things? Amanda, how about you? What was your article?
All right, so I did a video. This was Stephen Ritz. The video was from 2012. So this is a high school teacher in the South Bronx who initiated this fantastic project where he worked with his students to create vegetable gardens in the school. And then that expanded into the students going out into the community and creating these beautiful vegetable gardens. But they're more intricate than just your average garden. They build this entire wall and the fruit is coming off of the wall. It's like in Willy Wonka with like the fruit wallpaper. Like they made this incredible, these edible gardens throughout the whole city of New York. And so he talks about two major takeaways that he had from initiating this project. So one was just how engaged and passionate the students became about cultivating these gardens. And, this is interdisciplinary work too. It's hands-on, it's collaborative, and, the students could physically see the fruits of their labor quite literally as they're going and they're planting this. And this is having the effect of improving the health within the community all throughout New York. People are having access to this healthy food. It's beautifying the community through these beautiful gardens everywhere. And so the students were so invigorated and invested in this project. And I think a lot of that is because, you know, it was hands-on, it was collaborative, and the students were able to physically see the results of the work they were putting in. And the other big takeaway, and he said, this is a direct quote, he says, kids don't have to leave their community in order to learn. This really resonated with me because there is this pervasive notion and a huge display of deficit mindset in which students from cities need to be bussed into the suburbs in order to have a better education. Bryan, I don't know if this was F2 or F3 that we were having this conversation in one of the discussion pods. I was driving myself crazy going back through all of the discussions in both classes to try to find it, and I couldn't. So if you can remember which reading it was that we were talking about with that, I would greatly appreciate it.
I can't remember. I can probably find it.
I was like going through every single discussion pod for both classes and I still couldn't find it. So that's fine. But the point was, I really appreciated that he said kids don't have to leave their community to learn. And what these kids were doing was learning how to give back to their own community. And many of the students landed full-time jobs just making these gardens after high school. So, you know, for me, a quote that this is not from the video and I can't recall where the quote actually comes from, but it's bloom where you are planted. And I love the idea that it's teaching students that they can't control where they were born, but they can learn how to use the resources around them and to work hard to get wherever it is that they want to go. And so just to fight that idea that they are where they're from, you know, that's not true. And they don't need to go anywhere else to have a good education. So
there was something I was reading for a different class where it talked about that value of experiential learning, right? Like getting out there and doing things in the community that's more impactful to students sometimes, you know, especially when you have students who come from historically oppressed and marginalized backgrounds, you know, and I know Amanda would have probably read it in the post, but I think, you know, for Trish, Francis, and Lori, I mean, I was that kid who was bused out of, I grew up in abject poverty in the north end of Harvard. And from the second grade, I got bused out to this super wealthy, you know, community. If you guys are familiar, I went to school in Farmington. So it was like from second grade, I call it this dichotomous existence where thankfully I still went back to my community. So I still felt connected to it. But there was this idea that, and the program was called Project Concern. So think about kind of just and my parents actually had me as high school kids in that same program, but just kind of the thought or the deficit thinking around taking kids from the north, you know, from the ghettos of Harvard, and you're busing them to these places with a name called Project Concern. And so when I hear about things like that, gardens, community gardens, a really, really huge way. I knew people in Detroit who were doing the same things. Great way of learning communities, but then also too, you think about social drivers of health, learning about nutrition and health benefits and things of that nature by growing gardens and stuff like that. Those are going to be things that are going to have, you know, better health outcomes, probably educational outcomes for all of those students. So it sounds like that was, you know, a really good TED Talk, and those students probably went through some impactful learning.
Yeah, it reminds me too of, I think it was a class we took this past spring where we were looking at really almost like just restructuring education and looking at different educational models. And again, like you were just talking about, Bryan, different progressive models of education that are currently out there. And one common thread that everyone of the articles had for this particular week, and it might even be the week that you guys are talking about for the discussion pod, was that community outreach and community involvement was a component of the progressive schooling system. And that just reminded me of this video, Amanda, because it's, again, it's engaging with the community. It's, and then that's deeper learning, that's relevancy, that's, and then you see that spark and that engagement in the students. It's because you are engaging themselves in their own community. So that was interesting.
I love that idea, and I love the quote that you pulled out too, Amanda. I just thought that was like a perfect connection to what you were summarizing for us. One of the things that is frustrating though is like you have, on one hand, you have this idea for promoting deeper learning, but at the same time, you're getting this push to perform on these standardized tests that hit, like we've done like maps and scopes and sequence, and it is incredibly challenging, and it's like a very challenging pacing guide to make sure that you can meet all of the standards over the course of a school year. And projects like that are amazing, and the kids will remember them for a lifetime. But at the same time, like, the number of standards that they wind up hitting are so few compared to the amount of time that you dedicate to do an incredible project like that. So like, that's the part that I think is always so hard, is like the pull between the required and the engaging, right? And the time that you need to invest in something that is so engaging, but at the same time, like, how do you hit all of the standards that you need to in a school year?
And that, Trish, I think, is the crux of the entire problem that we're having. Some of the standards are just so restrictive that they prevent teachers from being able to really reach the students. And the students don't know how it works. They just think my teacher's boring and doesn't care about what interests me. But that's not true. We would love to spend so much time finding out what engages you and teaching it, but our jobs are on the line. And so just navigating that balance between designing a curriculum for our particular students in front of us and appeasing administration and then the state, it's such a tough balance.
But one of the people who responded to the voices of the people thing kind of talked about that there's not a lot of time to really invest in getting to know who the students are, or kind of their interests and things like that. And it sounds like, because you guys are up against so much pressure around standardized testing, and yet what gets missed. And this is a person in an urban district, so they talked about the challenges that those students face. So this is a teacher from that same community she's teaching in, and so there's not a lot of time to explore that. And so that becomes difficult in that kind of setting, where I feel like in higher education, sometimes there's a little bit more flexibility to get to know students. And so I think that does become tough, because you're kind of missing out on what engagement styles, may really get students the most, in their learning. So
it made me also think, there's just already so much missed time too.
Yeah.
I know there's been a huge uptick in attendance issues, huge uptick in behavioral problems. So it becomes back to, I forget if it was Trish or Bryan who said it, but you look at what goes in and what doesn't go into the curriculum. We're already making those decisions. We're already not hitting all the standards, or at least in my school, we're not. We have students well below grade level, so we're trying to get them up to grade level. Then we have all these behavioral problems, and then we have a couple projects like that. We have a community garden, and it's like, I can see why someone would argue that, like, you guys don't have time to do any of those things, because what do you do? What do you leave out of geometry that you don't need? What do you leave out of science if everything builds? What do you skip? And it's an impossible question. Especially
those are Trish's words. I wouldn't want to steal her words. That was her breakdown.
That was actually from the article. Those weren't my words.
And you're the one who spoke it, so I'm like, I don't want to take credit for it. That was her.
But it's the question that we always struggle with. That's why, like, time is the most important commodity in schools. It's not money. It's it's not materials. It's time is the most valuable commodity in a school.
Look at us, overtime. All right.
I'm going to stop this recording for us.
Okay.
Great job.